Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me for today's video devotion. If you were not in worship yesterday, let me encourage you to watch the sermon. I preached a message titled What America Needs from Us. You can find it on our Facebook page, YouTube channel, church website, so go ahead and check that out. Today we are in John's Gospel, chapter 15. And the verse that I want to use to anchor my thoughts, and by the way, I hope you've already read this chapter and have your journal and something to write with, but is in John 15, verse 11, where Jesus says, "These things I have spoken to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full," wanting us to be filled with His joy. And when He talks about these things that He's spoken, He's referring, I think, to everything He says during this conversation in the upper room and in the Garden of Gethsemane. But I'm going to limit my thoughts to chapter 15, which we're reading today. So what are some of the things He said that's key to us having His joy in us? Well, there's two things I want to point out. One is that we need to abide in Jesus Christ. In the first part of this chapter, verses 1 through 8, he uses the analogy of a vineyard and says that Jesus, is the vine, and God the Father is the vine dresser, the one who prunes and takes care of the vineyard. We, His followers, His disciples, are the branches that sprout out from the vine, and our goal, our job is to produce fruit, and the Father prunes us, cuts us back, and works in our life so that we will become even more productive. And He says that we are bearing fruit for God. But in verse 8, if you look at it, He said, "My Father is glorified by this," when we produce fruit and allow God to prune us and work in our life so that we become more effective, more productive as disciples. God is glorified, and we bear much fruit. But notice this, He says, so prove to be my disciples. One of the things we do to give evidence of being a disciple, follower of Christ, one of the things that proves we really are followers of Jesus is we bear fruit. And not only do we bear fruit, but we let God work in our lives to produce more fruit, make us more productive, more effective than we have been in the past. We don't stay still and we don't go backwards. We keep growing, becoming more productive. And so as he talks about that, he says that's one of the things that you do. And he says, "I said all this to you so that my joy can be in you and be full. You can be full of my joy." So if we are growing and becoming more productive, more effective for Christ, then we are having His joy in us. And when we don't grow, we don't have the joy of salvation. We don't have the joy of Jesus. We don't have the joy of our Father. So if you want to be happier as a believer, start growing. Let God prune you and make you more productive as a disciple. The second thing is, he says, we need to abide in His love. He says in verse 9, "Just as the Father has loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love." Just as He said you can't bear fruit without abiding in Jesus, here we need to also not only abide in Jesus, we need to abide in His love. In verse 10, "If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandment and abide in His love." And then verse 12, he said, "This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you." Continuing in 13, "Greater love is no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you." And then lastly, verse 17, "This I command you, that you love one another." So Jesus says, if you want my joy to be in you, abide in my love. What does it mean to abide in His love? Well, it means you obey Him. That's what He says here, that if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. If you're not keeping my commandments, it's because you don't love me. So loving Jesus means we keep His commandments. We obey Him. And it also means we love one another. He talks about that in this same passage, a new commandment, that we love one another. So how do I abide in the love of Jesus? I obey Jesus and I love other people, especially other believers. It means I'm abiding in love. And when you live in love, you have joy. Compare that to somebody who's always angry, who's always upset with people, who's mad at people, doesn't forgive people, who's always trying to get even with people. Somebody who's selfish. They don't have joy. They don't have joy. You want the joy of Jesus? Learn to love. Love people and learn to obey Him. Love and obey Jesus because you love Him, not out of duty, but out of, man, I love Jesus and that's what I want to do. And then you abide in Jesus. You're intimate with Christ. You grow in your intimacy with Christ. You grow in your effectiveness and your production as a disciple. And Jesus said, He said all of this in chapter 15 so that in verse 11, my joy may be in you and that your joy may be made full. If you're not a very happy disciple, ask yourself, are you growing? Are you growing spiritually? Are you growing in Christ's likeness? Are you growing in productivity and effectiveness for Christ? Is your character growing? Your attitude? Your thought life? The way you live? Your holding? Are you growing? And are you abiding in Jesus' love? Learning to obey Him because you love Him and it's just what you want to do, and loving His people. Oh, by the way, if you never go to church, you probably don't love His people. If you think you don't need the family of God, you probably don't love the family of God. And if you don't love God's people, then you really don't love Him no matter what you say. You want God's joy in your life? Learn to love God and show it by loving people and show it by obeying Him, and abide in Jesus. Grow in your relationship with Jesus Christ, and His joy will fill you. God bless you. Look forward to being with you tomorrow as we jump over to chapter 16 in John's Gospel.